When a police officer was teetering on the edge of death, his K9 partner showed up just in time to do something no one else could. But what happened next would change his life forever. It was pouring cats and dogs outside, turning the streets into slick, shiny paths. Inside a parked police car on a quiet street, Officer Jake Thompson was fiddling with his tactical gear, stealing glances at his four-legged buddy. Max, his German shepherd, was sitting alert in the passenger seat, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the area. They'd been through tons of calls together, but something about this one felt off. The dispatcher's voice had a serious edge that Jake couldn't shake, a feeling of urgency that was hard to ignore. Unit 45, we've got some shady stuff going down at the old warehouse on Pine Street. Possible armed guys. Be careful. Backup is on the way. The radio crackled. Jake took a deep breath, giving Max a reassuring pat on the head. All right, buddy, it's just us for now. Stay sharp. Max responded with a low, approving growl, his body tense and ready. The warehouse stood tall against the dark sky, its peeling paint and rusty doors looking like giant, silent guardians. Rain dripped from broken shingles above, the steady patter sounding eerie in the night. Jake moved carefully, gun in hand, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Max stayed close, sniffing the damp air, ears perked up at every little sound. Suddenly, Jake stopped dead in his tracks as muffled, hurried footsteps echoed from inside the building. He raised his fist, signaling Max to hold. The silence was thick, almost unbearable. Then, a loud metallic crash echoed. Something hit the ground and rolled across the concrete. Before Jake could figure out what was happening, a sharp pain shot through his left side. He stumbled back, vision blurry, trying to stay on his feet. His hand went to his side, slick with blood. Collapsing onto the wet ground, the world spun around him. Max didn't move an inch. He stood firm beside Jake, eyes locked on the shadows ahead. Out of nowhere, 3 figures appeared, outlined against the faint light from a distant street lamp. One of them was holding something in his hand while the other 2 whispered to each other with menacing tones. Jake tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper. Max, stay. But the dog didn't flinch. Instead, Max let out a deep, threatening growl, showing he was ready to protect Jake no matter what. As Jake's strength faded, Max faced the 3 men alone. What happened next wasn't just a game changer for that night. It showed just how strong the bond between a cop and his dog could be. The rain kept coming down, pounding the pavement as Max held his ground. His paws were steady on the slippery ground, ears back and focused. Jake was just a few feet away, breathing shallowly, the bloodstain on his uniform spreading. He tried to lift his head to see what was going on, but he was quickly losing strength. All he could hear was Max's steady growl, full of warning and determination. The guys started moving closer, their boots splashing in puddles as they exchanged nervous looks. "It's just a dog," one of them muttered, but his tone showed he wasn't so sure. Max's growl got louder at the comment, his stance becoming more defensive, ready to jump. His eyes never left the men, reading every tiny movement, while the rain kept falling, making everything feel tense. One of the men took the first step toward Max, moving slowly and deliberately. He reached out as if he was being friendly, but his hesitation was clear. Max didn't back down. He stayed put, eyes fixed on the man. The guy paused, then glanced over his shoulder. "We don't have time for this. Grab the cop and let's go." Hearing this, Jake mustered all the strength he had left. He tried to grab his radio, his hand shaky as it touched the wet ground. "Max," he whispered so softly only the dog could hear. Max's ears twitched at the sound of his name. Their connection was unspoken but strong, built on trust and loyalty. Max's growl got even louder, like he was answering Jake's silent call for help. The men hesitated, clearly freaked out by Max's unwavering stance. One of them signaled the others. "Forget it, let's go." But before they could make a move, the distant sound of sirens cut through the rain-soaked silence. It was faint, but enough to make the guys panic. They exchanged frantic looks, their plan falling apart as time ran out. As they slipped back into the darkness, Max stayed put, making sure they were really gone before turning his full attention back to Jake. He moved quickly to Jake's side, his wet fur brushing against Jake's arm. Even though he was exhausted, Jake managed a weak smile and reached out to touch Max's neck. The sirens got louder, signaling that help was finally on the way. Max stayed by Jake's side, a silent promise to stick around no matter what. Backup was arriving, but Max's actions that night were something no one would forget. What happened next really solidified the bond between Jake and Max, a bond built on loyalty and bravery. The flashing lights of the backup units finally pierced the darkness, their red and blue beams dancing across the rain-soaked pavement. Officers poured out of their cars, weapons ready, scanning the area for any threats. Max stayed protectively close to Jake, his fur soaked but his eyes still sharp and alert. He growled low at the sight of new strangers approaching, his loyalty unwavering despite being worn out. "Officer down," one of the first responders called into his radio as he rushed to Jake's side. The officer knelt down, his gloved hands quickly checking Jake's wound. "Stay with us, Thompson," he urged. Jake's eyes fluttered open for a second, immediately focusing on Max. Even though he was weak, he tried to speak. "Max saved me," he mumbled, his words barely audible over the chaos. As paramedics arrived, Max stepped back reluctantly, ears flat as they worked to stabilize Jake. Officer Mike Grant crouched beside Max, speaking softly. "It's okay, boy. We've got him now." But Max didn't move far. His eyes stayed locked on Jake, watching every move as if he understood how serious things were. The paramedics worked quickly, applying pressure to Jake's wound and lifting him onto a stretcher. "He's critical, but he's got a chance," one of them said as they loaded him into the ambulance. Max tried to jump in after them, his paws scraping the slick metal, but an officer gently held him back. "Easy, Max. He's in good hands now." Max whined softly, pacing anxiously as the ambulance sped away with Jake inside. The other officers stayed on high alert, spreading out to search the area for the suspects. "They couldn't have gotten far," Grant said, his voice steady but tense. He glanced at Max, who was still restless, clearly sensing that something wasn't finished yet. As minutes ticked by, another officer approached Max with a leash, trying to calm him down. But before they could secure it, Max froze. His ears perked up at a faint noise, the crunch of gravel underfoot that the officers hadn't noticed. Max let out a low, urgent bark, his body turning toward the shadows. Grant followed Max's lead, his hand automatically going to his holstered weapon. "What is it, Max?" he asked, but Max's reaction made it clear. The danger wasn't over yet. As the officers got ready to follow Max's lead, the tension in the air thickened. Whatever Max had sensed in the shadows was about to bring them face to face with a threat Jake had barely escaped. The officers exchanged tense looks as Max's bark cut through the damp night air. His stance was firm, ears forward, and his gaze fixed on the dark area beyond the warehouse. Officer Grant tightened his grip on his flashlight, his other hand on his holstered weapon. "Spread out, but stay alert," he ordered, his voice steady but low. "If Max is onto something, we need to trust him." Max moved cautiously toward the edge of the lot, nose to the ground tracking the scent. The rain made his coat slick, but his movements were precise and deliberate. Grant followed closely, his flashlight beam cutting through the misty air. The gravel crunched under their boots as the group moved forward, nerves on edge. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified by the surrounding silence. "Got something over here," one officer called from near the side of the warehouse. Max's head snapped toward the voice, and he darted forward, tail straight like a flag signaling focus. Grant and the others followed quickly, adrenaline pumping as they reached a partially open door. The faint glow of a flashlight revealed footprints in the mud leading inside. Grant motioned for silence, signaling the team to spread out. Max was the first to step through the door, paws landing silently on the concrete floor. The inside of the warehouse was dark, the air thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Max moved carefully but determinedly, his nose working overtime as he followed the scent deeper into the shadows. A faint but distinct noise, A scuffle of feet, a whispered curse, reached Max's ears. Grant raised his hand, signaling the team to stop. Max froze in place, ears twitching as he zeroed in on the source. The tension was thick, every second dragging on as they waited for something to happen. Suddenly, a figure burst out from behind a stack of crates, running toward the far exit. Officer Grant shouted, his voice echoing through the vast space. Max didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed, he charged after the suspect, powerful strides closing the distance in seconds. The suspect glanced over his shoulder, panic flashing in his eyes as he realized he couldn't outrun the determined K9. As Max closed in, the officers prepared to intercept. What happened next showed just how crucial the bond between man and dog could be in the face of danger. The sound of pounding footsteps echoed through the huge warehouse as Max chased the fleeing suspect. The man's panic was clear. Heavy breathing and desperate looks over his shoulder showed his growing fear. Max's strides were relentless, his body low and streamlined as he pursued his target. Behind him, Officer Grant and the team moved swiftly, shouting commands for the man to stop, but it was Max leading the charge. The suspect reached the far exit and yanked at the door, but it jammed halfway, scraping loudly against the concrete. The delay was all Max needed. With one powerful leap, he was on the man's heels, his commanding bark filling the air like a warning. The suspect froze, hands instinctively rising as if surrendering would somehow calm the determined K9. Max stood firm, growling low, piercing eyes locked on the man. Grant and the other officers reached them seconds later, weapons drawn. "Don't move," Grant ordered, his voice sharp and unwavering. The suspect dropped to his knees, hands still raised as the officers moved in to secure him. Max stayed in position, his growl easing slightly, but his focus unwavering. Only when Grant clipped the man's wrists with handcuffs did Max step back, his job done for now. As the officers began questioning the suspect, another sound caught Max's attention, a faint rustling from deeper inside the warehouse. His ears perked up, and his head turned sharply toward the noise. Grant noticed immediately. "What is it, Max?" he asked, but the dog didn't wait for a command. He started moving quickly and deliberately. Grant signaled the rest of the team, who followed Max as he led them toward the far end of the building. The air grew colder, the faint hum of machinery mixing with the sound of dripping water from the leaky roof. They reached an old storage room, the door slightly ajar. Max stopped just outside, sniffing intensely. With a low, determined bark, he stepped back and looked at Grant, signaling for the humans to proceed. The officers opened the door carefully, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, they found the second suspect crouched behind a stack of broken pallets, clutching a makeshift weapon. "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. The man hesitated for a moment, then dropped the object with a clang, raising his hands in defeat as the officers moved in to detain him. Max stood nearby, watching intently. Even after two suspects were in custody, his posture stayed alert. Something in his body language said the night wasn't over yet. Max's instincts had already been a game-changer, but as the team got ready to leave, the loyal K9 sensed something still wasn't right, a discovery that would reveal an even bigger threat. The tension hadn't eased, even with two suspects down. Max's body language told the officers everything they needed to know. This wasn't finished. His sharp eyes darted around the warehouse, ears twitching at every faint sound. Officer Grant crouched down beside him, speaking calmly. "What is it, boy? You've got something, haven't you?" Max let out a soft, determined bark and turned his head toward the darkened loading bay at the back of the warehouse. Grant signaled to the team to stay sharp. "Max is onto something." The officers moved carefully, flashlights illuminating the scattered debris and rusted machinery that cluttered the space. Max led the way, nose low to the ground as he tracked the scent that seemed to get stronger with every step. The rain outside had slowed, but the warehouse roof kept dripping, each drop echoing ominously in the stillness. As they approached the loading bay, Max stopped abruptly, his body stiff. A low growl rumbled from his throat, and his eyes locked onto a large metal container pushed against the far wall. The container was dented and rusty, its lid slightly ajar. The officers exchanged wary glances. "That doesn't feel right," one of them murmured, gripping his flashlight tighter. Grant stepped forward cautiously, weapon drawn. "Cover me," he instructed the others with deliberate care. Using the tip of his flashlight, he nudged the lid open wider. Inside, he found something that made his stomach drop, a small stash of weapons, and a bag filled with what looked like cash and IDs. "Looks like they were planning something bigger," he muttered, stepping back to let the others check it out. But before anyone could process the discovery, a sudden noise erupted from above, the sharp creak of metal followed by the unmistakable sound of movement. Max reacted first, barking loudly and lunging toward the source of the sound. The officers pointed their flashlights upward, catching a glimpse of a third suspect perched on a steel beam. The man had been hiding, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Grant shouted as the man moved quickly, leaping down onto a stack of crates in an attempt to escape. Max was faster. Before the suspect could make a full run for it, the K9 intercepted him, blocking his path with a commanding bark. The man hesitated, clearly shaken by the dog's ferocity. The officers closed in, surrounding him with weapons drawn. Realizing he had no way out, the man slowly raised his hands, his face pale with defeat. With all the suspects in custody, the officers thought the night was finally over. But what they uncovered in the hidden stash would lead to a revelation far bigger than they had anticipated. With the third suspect secured, the tension in the warehouse began to ease, but Max's vigilance remained unbroken. Officer Grant glanced down at the dog, who was still fixated on the container they had opened moments earlier. "What else is there, boy?" he murmured, crouching beside Max. The dog sniffed the air again, then turned back to the container, letting out a soft but insistent bark. Grant exchanged a glance with one of the officers. "Let's take a closer look," he said, pulling on his gloves as he carefully lifted the remaining contents from the container. What he found made his stomach twist. The cash and explosives were serious, but beneath them was a folder, worn and water-stained, filled with documents and maps. He spread them out on a nearby crate, using his flashlight to examine them. The markings on the maps showed multiple locations across the city, each circled and annotated with dates. "This wasn't just a robbery," Grant said, his voice grim. "They were planning something much bigger. These locations, key infrastructure points. This could have been catastrophic." The weight of the discovery hung heavy in the air as the officers silently absorbed the implications. Max, sensing the unease, let out another low growl, as if he understood the seriousness of what they'd stumbled upon. The detained suspects were led out of the warehouse one by one, their faces a mix of anger and defeat. The third man, the one who had been hiding on the beams, sneered as he was pushed into the back of a squad car. "You think this stops anything?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Grant didn't respond, but his jaw tightened as he closed the car door. Back in the warehouse, Max stayed close to Grant as the remaining officers bagged the evidence. "If it wasn't for him," one officer said, nodding toward Max, "we might have walked right past all of this. Who knows how long it would have been before we realized what they were planning." Grant looked down at Max and scratched behind his ears. "He's more than a partner," Grant said softly. "He's the real hero tonight." He affectionately scratched Max's neck. "Jake's lucky to have you. We all are." With one last glance at the darkened warehouse, the team loaded up the evidence and headed back to the station, knowing that Max had not only saved lives that night, but also uncovered a plot that could have devastated their city. As they left the warehouse behind, the full scope of what they'd discovered began to take shape, but the danger wasn't fully over yet. A new challenge awaited, and once again, Max would prove to be an irreplaceable hero. The early hours of the morning brought a strange calm to the station as the officers returned with the suspects and the evidence. Rain still tapped against the windows, but inside, there was an air of tension as the team started piecing together the full scope of the plot they'd uncovered. Max walked beside Grant, his tail swaying slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, but his keen eyes never stopped observing the flurry of activity around him. The evidence was spread across a long table in the station's briefing room. The maps, documents, and weapons painted a chilling picture. The circled locations on the maps weren't random. They included key bridges, a power substation, and even a hospital. The dates matched upcoming public events, times when these places would be crowded. The dates match, Grant said quietly, his voice heavy. They were planning a coordinated attack. Captain Morales entered the room, her expression serious. This isn't just a local matter anymore. I've already contacted the federal authorities. They'll be here by noon to take over. She paused, glancing down at Max, who sat dutifully by Grant's side. Make sure someone arranges a place for this dog. Without him, we wouldn't have uncovered any of this in time. Grant nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He's the real hero tonight, he said, scratching Max's neck affectionately. Meanwhile, Jake's condition remained critical but stable. The officers who had visited the hospital reported back that he was responsive but weak, his first words being a question about Max. Grant knew he had to visit Jake soon, but there was still work to be done. Max, however, seemed to sense something. He whined softly, as if missing his partner. You'll see him soon, Grant assured the dog. The suspects, now in separate interrogation rooms, refused to speak. One of them, the man who had hidden on the warehouse beams, simply smirked when questioned. You stopped us tonight, he said coolly, but you're too late to stop me. Very thing. His cryptic words sent a chill through the room. Grant clenched his fists but kept his composure, glancing at Max, who stood near the door, head tilted as though he sensed the tension too. As the hours stretched on, the team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the evidence with known associates of the suspects and sending urgent updates to federal agencies. Every officer knew the clock was ticking. For now, they had stopped one part of a dangerous plan, but the suspect's warning lingered ominously in everyone's minds. Max stayed close to Grant, his unwavering presence reminding everyone that sometimes the most vital protector came on 4 legs, not 2. Just as the team thought they had contained the threat, a new lead emerged, one that would send them racing against the clock once again, with Max leading the charge. The mood in the station shifted abruptly when an analyst rushed into the briefing room, clutching a newly decoded piece of evidence. We missed something, she said, her voice shaking with urgency. She spread a map across the table, pointing to a location that hadn't been marked before, a shipping yard on the outskirts of town. One of the documents mentioned a delivery scheduled for that morning. If we're right, they might have been planning to move explosives or weapons to another location. Officer Grant felt his stomach tighten. How much time do we have? He asked the analyst. She glanced at her watch. If the timing in the document is accurate, less than an hour. Grant turned to Max, who stood by his side, ears perked up as if ready to move. Let's go, Grant said firmly. He gathered his team, and within minutes, they were speeding toward the shipping yard with sirens blaring. When they arrived, the yard was eerily quiet. The massive shipping containers stood like towering monoliths under the gray morning sky. Grant stepped out of the car, scanning the area as Max jumped down beside him. The dog's nose went to work immediately, sniffing the air as he led the team toward the heart of the yard. The officers moved in formation, eyes darting between the towering stacks of containers, each step echoing ominously on the concrete ground. Max stopped suddenly near a cluster of containers, his body stiff and nose pressed to the ground. He barked sharply, signaling the team to focus on one particular container. Grant motioned for the officers to secure the area as he inspected the container. The lock had been broken, and the door was slightly ajar. Grant pulled it open cautiously, revealing a chilling sight: crates filled with materials that could be used to make explosives. It's a cache, and we've found it just in time, he said as the team worked quickly to secure the evidence. A shout came from one of the officers stationed nearby. We've got movement from the far side of the yard. 2 figures bolted from behind a stack of containers, trying to escape. Max didn't hesitate. With a burst of energy, he took off in pursuit, his speed unmatched as he closed the gap between himself and the fleeing suspects. Grant and the others followed, but it was clear Max would reach them first. The suspects were cornered, their cover blown, and the cache secured. The final moments of the mission would test the courage of both man and dog, leading to a conclusion no one would forget. Max surged ahead, his focus locked on the fleeing suspects as they weaved through the maze of shipping containers. The officers followed closely behind, boots pounding against the wet concrete. It was clear Max was the fastest among them. His bark rang out, sharp and commanding, as if warning the suspects there was nowhere left to run. The two men glanced back in panic, realizing they had underestimated the determined K9. One of the suspects stumbled, losing his footing on the slippery ground. Max reached him within seconds, standing guard and barking to alert the officers. The man froze, raising his hands in surrender as the officers moved in to detain him. But the second suspect didn't stop. He darted toward a truck parked near the edge of the yard, desperation driving him to make one last escape attempt. Grant shouted, "Max, go." The dog bolted toward the truck with relentless speed. The suspect clambered into the cab, fumbling with the keys, but before he could start the engine, Max leapt onto the running board, barking fiercely. The noise startled the man, causing him to drop the keys in his panic. Grant and the other officers arrived moments later, pulling the suspect out of the truck and placing him under arrest. The scene finally settled into an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of distant sirens as backup arrived. As the suspects were escorted away, Grant crouched down to Max, who was panting but still alert, his tail wagging slightly. "You did it, buddy," Grant said, his voice filled with pride. "You stopped them." Max leaned into Grant's hand as he scratched behind his ears, the bond between them stronger than ever. Nearby, the officers secured the cash and explosives, making sure the dangerous materials would never reach their intended targets. By the time they returned to the station, word of Max's actions had spread. Officers gathered to greet the returning team, offering applause and pats on the back for both the officers and their K9 hero. Later that day, Grant took Max to visit Jake in the hospital. Though weak, Jake managed to smile as Max entered the room, his tail wagging furiously. "You saved my life, boy," Jake murmured, his hand reaching out to stroke Max's fur. The dog nuzzled his partner gently, a silent promise that he would always protect him no matter the danger. The mission was over, the suspects apprehended and the city safe, all thanks to the courage of one incredible K9. Max's actions would be remembered not only as heroic, but also as a testament to the unbreakable bond between man and dog.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.